I would like, first of all, to thank all of you for attending this session, and particularly to our three speakers in this session for accepting our invitation. Well, my name is Carlos Bravo. Basically a PhD researcher at the Barcelona Institute of International Studies and the Pompeu Fabra University in Barcelona. I'm very close to finishing my PhD that studies the role of the European Union in the management of different crises. Without further ado, we will, introduce our three speakers to this panel. All these panels are related to the topic of publishing. So we have in the first place, Professor Toni Bertelli, who is a professor of public policy and political science at Penn State University, as well as a senior research fellow at the Barcelona Institute of International Studies. His research examines the role of political institutions in shaping public policy outcomes and organizational structures in both American and comparative settings. Just to let you know, he's also a senior executive editor of Journal of Public Policy, and serves on the editorial boards of several journals, including, for example, the British Journal of Political Science. And what else? I could go on and on, but he's basically author of more than 50 articles and books, author or co-author. I hope I did justice to your excellent background. Then I will introduce as well Dr. Toni Haastrup. She's a senior lecturer in international politics at the University of Stirling. She's also a graduate of the University of California, Davis, and earned her PhD at the University of Edinburgh, also graduate from the University of Cape Town. Her research explored the nature of global power hierarchies between the global North and South in knowledge and practice. A part of her current research agenda draws on critical feminisms to understand the foreign policy practices of both institutions. She's published in several journals, including the Journal of Common Market Studies, where she's actually currently serving as editor-in-chief, and Foreign Policy Analysis, a Journal of European Integration. And she's also an executive committee member of Women Also Know Stuff, member of the ISA Committee on the Status of Women, and she co-convenes the UASIS Research Network Gendering US Studies. Welcome. Also Dr. Maxine David will speak in this session. She's a lecturer in European Studies at Leiden University and research fellow at the Global Europe Center at the University of Kent in the UK. She's a foreign policy analyst specializing in Russian and EU foreign policy. She has co-edited and contributed to a number of special issues and edited collections on EU-Russia relations, and is currently working on a monograph for Palgrave, The Triumph of Agency and Russia's Foreign Policy. Her areas of interest, as said, foreign policy analysis, foreign policies of Russia, the European Union, the UK, and the USA. She's also interested in a range of foreign policy issues. Basically, she has a PhD in International Studies from the University of Surrey in the UK, and she's also an editor of the Journal of Contemporary European Research. So quite authorized voices we have here in this panel. Basically, the first part of it will last approximately 60 minutes. We will have to finish at 11:30 sharp, despite we started a little bit late. I'm really sorry about that. But here in this first part, I will just raise a couple of questions so that our speakers can share their thoughts about them. And the second part will consist of questions and answers from the audience. Okay, so in case you have any thoughts, please feel free to write on the chat. I'm pretty sure that you can all access it. If you were not able, just let me know somehow. But anyways, let's just get started. Let's say the first question would be something very general. What general advice would you give early career researchers or PhD researchers that are just starting out on their publication journey? I don't know who wants to start.
I think, well, first of all, welcome everybody. And it's an incredible thing to start an academic career. It feels like a very long time ago for me, and I do want to note that I've been a professor for 21 years, so I have a very different perspective, potentially from those who are much closer to PhD. And also, I sort of grew up, as it were, in the American system, but I've also served on the faculty of Bocconi University in Italy and University of Birmingham, University of Manchester. So I do have a bit of perspective there, but just to sort of position the kinds of remarks. I'm not going to say very much in response to this particular question, because in some sense, the best advice that I can give, and the advice that I always give to my doctoral students, is to maintain it, to choose projects that you can maintain a medium-term interest in, and also that build into something that is much more synthetic, so that you're beginning to build a career. And it's very tempting to say, if I do this, I will get a publication in X. And yes, that's true. And yes, it's important, particularly if you're on a tenure track or you're going through probationary periods. You've got to put the publications on the CV, or else it's not going to go particularly well. But to the extent that you can pull back and see how things are fitting together, I think it's important to do that at all times in your career. Because when we get to the point of evaluating you and for promotion, for other positions, things like that, that's what we're looking at. You know, what does this scholarly record start to pull together? And you know, we'll talk about undoubtedly a lot of very specific kinds of things that you'll be doing in terms of publication. But what I can say at the beginning is do think about what your publications will amount to. And that goes also for saying, you know, if you have a project that is a book-length project and you are in a department that respects book publications, that's a wonderful thing to do. It's not so imperative that you cut up that book into a few articles so you can get a few more things on the CV. On the other hand, you may be cross-pressured in this way. There are lots of incentives in contemporary academia that pressure you to do things other than what I'm suggesting right now, which is to think a little bit more synthetically. But to the extent that you can, it's always good for your career. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Maybe Dr. David wants to add something here.
Hello, thank you. Thank you very much to the organisers for the invitation, and thank you very much to the audience for being here. It's really good to see so many on screen, although I very much regret not being in Barcelona. I want to give one bit of advice, first of all, that's nothing to do with publications, but it is about updating your profile on your university website, since most of what is on mine is apparently out of date. So I'm no longer editor of JSA, but I was for about 12 years, and I'm just starting out on a new editing opportunity, which everyone will hear more about in the next few months, but I'll leave you hanging for now. In terms of and just one other thing, I want to echo Olga's announcement about positions on the Graduate Forum. When I was editing JSA, I worked briefly with Ben LaRusse when he was on the Graduate Forum, and I worked for a longer time with Catherine Simpson on JSA. And if you know anything about Ben LaRusse and Catherine Simpson, I don't think you're following their career trajectories and thinking they would be bad models to follow, really. So I do think that it is really, really important for your career, but I also think it's very, very important to establish yourself very early on as the type of academic who wants to give back to the wider academic community. So I really, really want to just kind of underline the importance of these types of roles. A few pieces of advice here. You know, the obvious one is go to conferences and network, but sit in on lots of different panels, not just what's on your research area as well, but just kind of hear how different people talk about different types of research, and then talk to other academics while you're actually there. Don't stay in your little bubble. And you know, I think one of the reasons why so many of us are members of UACs is because UACs always offers a great conference for doing this, for kind of going, you know, for you to go. I remember UACs was my second conference and was a huge difference to the first one I went to, where nobody would talk to me and it felt like everybody had their back turned to me and they were in circles and I couldn't penetrate it. Whereas at UACs, people open up their circles, right? And you can have good conversations with academics about precisely these types of issues, right? So that would be my first piece. My second would be to read, and to read an awful lot, and not so much for the substance of the article, but for the writing, for the structure, for that kind of balance of theory, method, and empirics, right? Read very critically who makes a really good, compelling argument for their work, right? What is weak, what is strong, all right? So really read critically for those purposes, not just because you want to stay up to date with your field, which of course is very important. My next two pieces are probably unpopular pieces of advice, right? I'm a big fan of edited volumes in issues. I've edited a lot of them, after all. And I think that as long as you are working with a good editor, and not all editors are good, I am, right? And I've always worked with other good editors as well. But at every time that I've worked with somebody else as an editor, all of us have been very keen on ensuring that we have got doctoral candidates there, early career researchers, and that we are spending the time with their article, helping them improve it, giving them advice, all right? And I get a lot of emails from people in those positions really talking about how much they learned, how grateful they were, and everything else. So these are not the things that actually look very good on your CV because of the very, what I would say, perverted way that academia is structured these days. But in terms of learning, as I say, if you've got a good editor, I think that that can be an invaluable experience. And also you build your network. You're part of something bigger than just your own work. My second piece of unpopular advice is write what you want to write. I think that you will be pushed by an awful lot of people throughout your career to do things that look good for your CV. But ultimately, this is your time and it's your life. Write what you're interested in. Don't be too worried about, what box am I in? What do I want to be known as? What do I want to be labeled as? Write eclectically if that's what you want to do. You'll also find certainly if you're in the UK system, all right, I'm no longer, thank goodness. So I don't have these pressures. So this is why it's unpopular advice. But writing for the ref means, for instance, that you don't do as much empirical work as you might want to, because the emphasis is, in terms of 4-star publications, is on those that are more theoretically driven or methodologically driven. I want to know where we all are without the empirics, right? How do we theorize without the empirics? So for me, the empirical work is just as important as the theoretical and the methodological. I don't dismiss any of them. And I don't think it is a great message to send out to people starting on their careers that they shouldn't do empirical work. But as I just really want to emphasize, this is not necessarily good advice in terms of your career trajectory. I think in terms of academia more widely, it's great advice. I think there'll probably be more kinds of questions where I can talk to these types of issues as well, but I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you so much, Dr. David. Before I give the floor to Dr. Haastrup, I just wanted to echo one of your comments. Actually, my first conference was organized by the UASIS Graduate Forum, actually, and I totally recommend it to you, our audience. It's an excellent venue to get started just because there's just PhD and early career researchers there. And I mean, you might feel a little bit more, less pressure as in a rather bigger venue with more senior attendees, and there's usually funding available for participants. So that keep an eye on Twitter, the UASIS Grad Forum account, to know when our call for papers will be released. Okay, I just wanted to now give the floor to Dr. Haastrup to see what her thoughts on this question are.
Thank you very much for inviting me here to the Graduate Forum, and I want to echo what everyone has said already. In a way, it's hard to beat that, but perhaps I can add 2 more things very briefly. The first is to, obviously, if your PhD, for example, depends on publications, then you have to do it, right? So there's no maybe not. And if your PhD doesn't depend on that, then maybe you have a bit of time. So I guess I just want to emphasize that obviously what is considered general advice at the beginning of your publication journey is different for different people. I think 2 things I wanted to mention. The first is that you need to publish where you read, or if you're thinking about publishing, think about publishing where you read or where you see yourself reading. And I think often, perhaps to echo some of what has already been said before, people have this idea of, a list that you definitely have to get into. But I think starting with your field and where because then you know exactly who it is that you're speaking to or who you want to speak to is really essential. And we can come back to that in a bit. But the second dimension for me is actually happens perhaps a bit outside of the publishing for itself, which is mentorship. I think it's really essential for early career researchers to seek mentors. And this can happen in a variety of ways. So it doesn't have to be someone who is hierarchically above you. So it doesn't have to be another professor stuff. For me, peer mentorship has helped a lot. It has led to other types of collaboration, including publishing collaboration. And again, those mentorship relationships would work in different ways because it is very relational and quite dependent on the people that are involved. But I can only say good things about mentoring for early career researchers, which definitely feeds into projects and publishing. Thanks.
Excellent, thank you very much. Now I will go over another question just to remind our audience, in case you have any thoughts, any questions yourself, please feel free to post them in the chat so that we will read them at some point at the end of the first part of the session. So second question to our speakers, in your view, what would be the most common, maybe rookie mistakes, so to say, that researchers make when submitting their research to a journal? Let's switch a bit the order of interventions. I will first give the floor now to Dr. David.
I don't love this question. And the reason that I don't is because in my experience at JSTOR, I saw as many problems from more established academics and sometimes very well established academics as doctoral candidates and ECRs. In fact, I would say that probably it seemed to me that doctoral candidates and ECRs approached everything with much more seriousness than the very well established academics. So I feel like this whole day is going to be me saying very unpopular things. So I'm not entirely sure that mistakes are only made by rookies. I suppose that there is a nervousness around doctoral candidates and ECRs that you don't see with more well-established academics. But there's certainly more politeness, more engagement with comments. So yeah, I'm honestly not sure what I would say to this, apart from the fact that so maybe I'll frame it more as things that you shouldn't do here. All right, always be polite, always. All right. many of us, I edited JSA for 12 years without remuneration, right? That was my give back to the community. And it used to then doubly annoy me when people were rude to me, right? I'm actually doing you a favor here. So just be polite. I just think that that's a basic thing. Ask questions, but don't be ridiculous in your question asking. I sometimes wondered if, especially doctoral candidates submitting, I did sometimes wonder where their supervisor was, right? I wondered why I was being asked these types of questions that really they should have asked their supervisors. So that is maybe a rookie mistake, right? Not to actually ask your supervisor some of the questions before you submit to a journal. But then I also concluded that that's probably just reflects the fact that some supervisors aren't very good supervisors. So I was always sympathetic to that. And I think probably letting go. Now I don't see this as an editor. So here I'm just kind of, it's conjecture and reflecting on how difficult I still find it to let go of work. All right. At some point, you've got to say, that's it. It's as good as it needs to be to send off to a journal, right? Get the feedback. And again, this is conjecture because I think that probably everybody at lots of people at different stages of their career suffer from this, but don't forget that this is about getting feedback as well. So even if you get rejected, if you get good feedback that helps you improve your article, focus on that, not on the rejection. I know this is very easy to say, all right, much harder to do, but much better if after a while you can kind of come back, right? Read it, be upset, go drink, do whatever you need to do to vent, go for a long run, don't care what it is. But do come back, do read the feedback and ask yourself, actually, is this helpful to me? All right. If they have misunderstood something, don't think, oh, this is just a kind of, review or two type thing. Say to yourself, is it because actually I didn't convey this well enough? All right. So just reflect properly on the feedback. But as I say, overwhelmingly, I felt that doctoral candidates and ECRs were, I kind of preferred reading their submissions.
Thank you very much. That's really good to hear. Okay, so now I'll give the floor to Dr. Haastrup.
Thank you for that. I kind of interpreted the question not as what early career researchers do, but what are basic mistakes that researchers make. And I think, it could apply to early career researchers, but it could also apply to professors. So the first one is not reading the scope of the journal or looking through what's actually been published in the journal, because I think sometimes there might be a variety of interpretations of what that scope is. So it's really useful to have a familiarity with what is actually gone in the journal, because there are sort of two main implications that I've seen of not doing this. One is that you submit something, say in our case, JCMS, that actually we read through and we think it would be a better fit for another top ranking EU journal, whether Journal of European Public Policy or European Security or European Union Politics, because of what it is that the author is trying to do. So that, JCMS is perhaps not the best fit. And contrary to what people think, you can't just substitute any of these journals for each other, right? It's not just sort of throwing your work and figuring out which one sticks. And often it's really easy to confirm this, so you've read through this work and you're sort of thinking, well, actually, I think it's a better fit for European Union politics. And you get to the end and you look at the bibliography, and a substantive amount of the work that looks at European politics was published in European Union politics. That would suggest that, that is perhaps a better venue. And if you think that, another journal, the one you're submitting to, is actually the best journal for it, then it is really important to engage in the work that has been done on that theme in that particular journal, because there's nothing more annoying than sort of that arriving and then you sort of say, this is the first time anyone has ever done this. And you're like, well, actually, I just processed 5 articles that were on that theme in the last 6 months. So do you not know the scope of your field, or are you not actually doing the reading? So, I mean, I think this is really important to get through that hurdle. I think another reason why this is important is from perhaps an ethical perspective, that, as journal editors, at least for my journal, we do pay attention to practices of knowledge production. And that requires, again, engaging in that broader field. We don't have this idea that there is a canon that you have to subscribe to. So, deviating from whatever you think is the canon is very welcome. Nevertheless, it is my sense that there are intellectual debts that have to be paid. And that requires, again, paying attention to the sort of journal that you want to work or submit to, and work with the editors in that journal. So when you're thinking about sort of framing your paper, you need to let us know how it departs from what has been published in that journal, how it builds on it, how it shows another dimension of it. Of course, another alternate route, particularly if you find that, well, actually a lot of what's been published on this theme has been maybe at another type of journal. You need to show us in the actual written work why this is less of a public policy issue. At least the approach that you've taken is less of a public policy issue, and therefore perhaps not as relevant to the Journal of European Public Policy. And this is more consistent with the kind of heterodox approach that is taken in a place like JCMS, that you need to articulate this. It is often useful, of course, that people tell you this, not all the time, but some of the time in the letters to the editor. But I think that also has to come through in the process of putting it together. But again, I would echo a lot of what Maxine has said already. I wouldn't ascribe this just to early career researchers. But yeah, I think, something that could be useful for them as well. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Haastrup. So Professor Bertelli, do you have any thoughts on this?
Sure, yeah. I think certainly what a few of the things that Maxine and Toni have said are absolutely correct in terms of this is not just a problem for early career researchers. We have badly prepared manuscripts by all of us, myself included. Sometimes you write papers that just don't quite work. And when you get the feedback, it's clear that they don't just quite work. What I will say is that the stress seems much greater when you're an early career researcher. It certainly was for me. And so there's a difference in perceiving that the way that this review process works. Another sort of, I suppose, throat clearing remark that's worth making is there have been a couple of references in Toni and Maxine's comments to this being a scholarly community in various ways in which we participate in it. I think it's unfortunately a bit harder to see that at the moment, because here we are as sort of squares on yet another Zoom. But as you go through this career, you'll realize that that's really how it works. And these interactions with scholars are extremely important. The reason I think these two things are important to say in talking about sort of whatever rookie mistakes that Carlos framed here is that we tend not to understand that the editors on the other side are, we're just individuals. I've done journal public policy for 11 years. If you write and ask us a question, we will respond. We have a process for doing those kinds of things. But if you write 5 times and say, I am interpreting some little aspect of the editorial management system to suggest that my paper has been under review too long, what's going on? That's another matter. And you're going to get a sort of formulaic response back because there are a lot of reasons, and we can talk about this with respect to another question. There are a lot of reasons why it takes a long time for manuscripts to happen. But I thought about what I would say in response to this question very quite a bit this morning. And I think it also draws from a couple of things that have been said, a comment about writing what you're interested in, reading in the area, right? And aiming for a particular journal that helps you make this kind of contribution. But there are two types of journals, right? There's a journal that is a generalist journal where you're making a contribution to the broader field and you have to frame it as such. And it has to, you know, it's not always the case that these contributions are broad, but they have to at least make a credible case to reviewers and editors that they are indeed broad. And then there are specialty journals, and those specialty journals are the kinds of advice that has been given so far is actually very important to those kinds of specialty journals where you really know your audience, know what the editors are looking for, know the sort of the sort of scope of the journal. But when you're on a sort of when you begin your academic career as in your first academic job, you are submitting to a mix of these kinds of things. And so the advice for thinking about these two types of journals is a version of the advice that you've been getting so far. How are the best papers, in your view, in those journals written, right? You read a lot, but you should read for the way that papers are written that are successful, right? In some subfields, writing papers is really quite formulaic. I'm thinking of things like political psychology or political, or how should I say it, quantitative political economy, CPE, things like this, right? You get papers that have a similar kind of format. A political theory paper is going to be structured very differently, and there are similarities in those kinds of papers as well. And as a graduate student, you read all these things, right? But understand that reviewers in those particular subfields are looking for papers that sort of fit the mold and make a contribution that is recognizable. And I think writing is something that's very hard to get used to. And I will say, you know, at my point in my career, I'm constantly thinking about writing because I'm trying to broaden the way that my exposition operates. But early on, there's a bit of trying to understand how to make the contribution. And the last thing I'll say about this is there's a reason that I'm suggesting that you look at the format in which contributions are delivered. It's because reviewers are, you know, volunteering their time, as has been said, right? Just like editors are volunteering their time. And volunteers sometimes don't give your papers the attention that you would like them to give. That's a fact of life. There's nothing you can do about that, except to present something in a clear way so that it's quite accessible to what they're doing. And so it's like writing a memo for a busy supervisor, in a sense. You're writing these papers for busy reviewers. And the strategies, I think I don't want to go on too long, but there are so many things that are going on, a sort of contemporary presentation of work. But the one example that I will give you is in many quantitative papers, there's a paper and then there's a review, or there's a supplemental appendix that is 5 times as long as the paper, has every conceivable table. And the authors are often really disenchanted when the reviewers come back and say, you know, here's a very important thing that you didn't consider. And it was considered on page 38 in table 16 of the appendix, right? That kind of interaction, right, should strike you immediately as the wrong way to approach the presentation, right? If that thing really is that important, you need to emphasize it in the text. You can point directly to those reviewer appendices. You can signal these kinds of things, but remember that you are showing these things to busy people. So I'll leave it at there. Thanks.
Thank you so much. These are really interesting comments. So let's move to another question. When we think about established academics such as yourselves, we think of people, I mean, that are really busy, that besides submitting the research to journals, they are engaging with different activities. For example, I mean, you're all part or have been part of an editorial team, but it's also common to contribute to the academic community as a reviewer, for example, or a board member in different organizations. So having this in mind, what would you say that I mean, about the disadvantages or advantages that actually early career researchers and PhD researchers try to go and engage in these types of activities that are not just purely submitting their research, publishing from the very early stage? Would you actually encourage this from the very start of our careers, or actually say, hold on, wait for a bit and then jump on this? So Dr. Haastrup, what do you think about this?
Okay, so I think it depends on what the editorial work is and what is considered an ECR. So if I was looking at myself, for example, I took on JCMS after about 6 years after I graduated from a PhD. But at this point, I had already had experience editing a book, reviewing for a few different journals, and being on editorial boards. And I think when I sort of think about, you know, the choice of appointment, I had the credibility to say, well, you know, I can do this job. And I think obviously that is important and essential to whether you will be allowed to do the job. But for me, again, another dimension is why. Why is it that you want to do this? So it would be silly to sort of pretend that, you know, doing a lot of these things don't have an impact on CVs or enhance CVs. But is that why you're wanting to do it? When I sort of think about, you know, the choice that I made about why I wanted to do it, I can't really divorce my choice to want to do JCMS from JCMS being a journal of UASIS. Similar to what Maxine said earlier, I've been a member of UASIS now for, I believe, 14 years. And this was very much part of wanting to support my community and what I feel is my community. And also shape the things that are really important to me for my community. But I would also say, you know, I'm able to do this because I paired up with an experienced partner. And this is, again, where I think mentorship is important. So, you know, most of you know who Richard Whitman is, and he's been a mentor to me for many years. So, you know, when I wanted to do this, he was enthusiastic enough. And he, of course, has experience doing everything twice over. And so although sort of that process of journal editing and editing JCMS in particular was quite new for both of us, I think it was really important to know that, you know, I had this support and this backup. And in any case, I wouldn't have wanted to do it alone because, again, my sort of approach to this kind of area is quite collaborative. But I mean, I guess, again, that's sort of a personal thing. But to sort of perhaps answer your question directly, I think, you know, if you're publishing, even though it's an individual matter for everyone, if you're publishing, then you should be reviewing, because someone else reviews your own work. And I mean, different people have different formulas for what it is that they review. So it's, I think it's like, for every article you submit, be willing to review 3, because that's how many reviewers usually would be asked to go on your article. But I think, again, everyone's personal circumstance is different. So maybe you're not even able to commit to that. But I think if you're publishing, and if you intend to publish, you should really be open to reviewing. And often, if you do enough of the reviewing, then you usually get asked to be on an editorial board. And when you are an editorial board, then you might get into this sort of nuts and bolts of actually doing editorial work. And then you might then graduate to associate editor and then higher. But I don't think that there should be any barrier on what stage of career people engage in this sort of work. That said, I tend to be quite protective of early career researchers, because editing is a lot of work. But I think if people can take it on, and it's the expertise that matters, then I think people should absolutely go for it. And hopefully they are supported by more senior colleagues.
Thank you very much. Professor Bertelli, please, what's your take on this?
So I don't have much to add either. I think that what Toni's offered is actually very wise. The one thing that I will say is that your context really matters. The job that you have really matters, right? So if you're in a place where you've got to publish a lot of things, and then I can say from experience, when I was, because of the amount that I was publishing, so you will get asked to review manuscripts because you publish. You just will, right? This is not a time in your life when people generally say no to those kinds of reviewers, to those review requests. We journal editors, every one of you knows, we're in a sort of crisis at the moment because there's more and more rejection of those requests for reviews. But from early career researchers, at least my experience is the acceptance rate for those requests is quite a lot higher. And there's a lot of things that I want to sort of leave to one side there. But when it comes to taking on something like an editorial, it's sort of an editorial task, you should really think about, right? So your immediate mentors in your department and group, they know your context, they know what's important. It would be hard for me to say that there's a good reason to take on one of these things at all times. I do think it matters for where you are in your career. At JPP, I have invited more frequently. I have invited senior people who are, shall we say, 4 years or so into the process post-PhD. Either they finished their postdocs, they're at their first job, they're securely at their first job, or they're, in the US system, they're late-term assistant professors who look like they're very much on the trajectory to get tenure. Those are the people that we tend to invite to the editorial board, because we don't want our journal to be involved in the kinds of conflicts that that you might end up in by making your job too hard. So we do try to target people who are ready to take these kinds of things on. We also make it very clear that we're not going to overwork you, so you won't get quite a lot of manuscripts to do. And there's no reason that you can't ask those kinds of questions when you get a request to join an editorial board. You know, how much will I be doing, so on and so forth. Those are totally reasonable questions for you to ask the editors. And that's that. So I guess that's what I have to say. There's no bright line rule here that I could sort of offer that would make any sense at all. But think about your context, and also, is this the journal that you want to be part of? You know, at JPP we develop a particular kind of community among our editorial team and our editorial board. I can talk about that at some point if you like, but and that's different from other journals. Those journals that get tons of submissions, we get about 250 a year. You know, a journal like the APSR gets 1,500, 1,200, something like that. Those you might be asked to do quite a bit more in those kind of things, but then the prestige of having that on your CV is quite important. So hence you can see it's difficult for me to say anything sort of general. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you actually for bringing up the issue, the special circumstances of the pandemic. We'll get to that in a future question, but before that, let's hear from Dr. David about this particular question.
Yeah, thank you. I just want to say kind of a few general things that I think that you should think about in relation to this type of a question, and then some specific things, you know, so like a reviewer versus an editor. The first general thing is that you have to remember that anything that you do is something else that you don't do, right? So you have to make choices, decide what it is that you want to do, right? But you can't do everything, right? Ask yourself what the career is that you want, right? I've taken a very particular route because what I wanted for my career was much more important to me than what other people thought my career should be, right? What's the reputation that you want, right? I know people who have flown high very, very quickly, mostly on the back of not doing an awful lot else for their community. And we all know these people, we all know who these people are. Now, you may not care if you have the reputation as being somebody who never ever gives back to the community. But, you know, so this is for you to decide, really, right? I have very clear views on how you should be there, but that's up to you. In terms of when you should do things, you know, when I first did, so we did a special, so when I did the national perspectives on Russia book with Hiski Haukala and Jackie Gower, I was barely out of my PhD, was doing a special issue first, and then we did the full book. So kind of connecting to Toni's point about mentorship, you know, Jackie had been around a long time. I'd been sitting listening to her in panels for years and years and years, and then I get to work with her, and Hiski was just fabulous. So, you know, it was great, but I was aware that I was very much the junior partner there. But actually, I had an awful lot to offer, and they were great mentors for me. So I found that a very, very positive experience. That was like 2 years out of my PhD. I think also it depends the specific points. Be a reviewer, definitely. As Toni says, the number of reviews that you do, I think, you know, depends very much on your situation. But I would come out very, very firmly and say you should absolutely be reviewing for journals, not only because of the give back and the fact that you're going to be reliant on people doing that for you, but because you learn so much, right? This is a good early introduction to the kind of back end of publishing, right? You've got to work with the editors as well. So I would say absolutely review. I think these have gone out of fashion, but some journals still publish them. I think write book reviews. Okay, I think that these are really, really good. And actually, I rarely read a good book review right from the start. So there's a real skill, and it's probably a dying skill, but I think the book reviews, a good book review, is so important. All right. And it helps you as well, right? If it's a very important book for you, it really helps you to kind of put your own thoughts in order about that particular book. The editorial board, I would say that that's not really in your gift, except for the work that you do prior to the invitation, and then you have to decide at any particular time whether you can take that on. In terms of being an editor of a journal, I would say, first of all, ask yourself, do you have the skills to edit, right? Because I think that academics are no better than, well, let's go with politicians today, no better than politicians in putting themselves into situations where actually they don't really have the skills to do it. So ask yourself, do I have the skills to do that? And if not, what do I need to do to acquire them? So this is not the time to be an editor of a journal or part of an editorial team on a journal, because I don't have the skills. But what I will do is spend the next couple of years kind of building those skills up so that I've got something to offer. And this is smart, not only for the wider community, but also for you, because it is being an editor, incredibly pressured. All right, you always have to be on it, even when other people think that you're not, you are. And yeah, I can't even tell you how much a source of pressure it was to me at times, which wasn't to say I didn't love it and didn't think it was valuable and everything else, but it was very, very difficult. So again, just kind of echoing what was said elsewhere, really think about the context. And then the final thing is, if you are going to edit, become an editor of a journal, think very carefully about the journal that you're going to edit. All right, make sure that you are a good fit for that journal as well. And I think generally, and I would say this is a general advice for all academics at any stage, whatever part of your career that you're talking about, but especially here, be humble, right? You're the kind of caretaker of a journal for a little amount of time. So you just kind of have to think about what has come before and what you want to come after. And we can see with JCMS when Toni and Richard and the rest of the team took that on, that they took a bit more of a radical interpretation, which I think was absolutely right. But there are other times you take on a journal and you actually just want somebody to continue steering that ship on a clear course. I do think, however, my final thing is, if there is a journal that still offers the chance to do special issues, it is definitely worth thinking about doing that. That is one of those stepping stones to, if you want to be an editor of a journal. When we were deciding between special issues, we were also thinking about how much editing experience those people had. So think about how much higher the bar is for when you are applying to be an editor of a journal. If you've not done something relatively simple, like be part of a team editing a special issue, you're unlikely to get that editorial position. But just to end on my first point, or one of my first points, right? You decide on the career that you want. If editing is part of it, go for it. But if it isn't, you can have a good career without doing too much of that.
Thank you so much. Just to remind our audience that, you have the chat in case you have any questions that, we will actually address them at the end of this first part. I know that maybe we're going to go a little bit over time with this first part. I'm really apologizing for that, but I would like to ask at least a couple more questions before giving the floor to our audience. So to three speakers, with the pandemic now, thinking about the current situation, manuscript review times have unfortunately sometimes, in some cases, increased significantly. But at the same time, we've seen that as a reaction to this, some schemes such as paid fast-track reviews have appeared, so that if you pay a fee, you are ensured to have your manuscript back with a decision in a relatively short time. To what extent do you think that this is a solution? I will first give the floor to Professor Bertelli.
Okay, so this will be very quick. We would never do such a thing at the Journal of Public Policy. I have never heard anything like this discussed at Cambridge University Press. It sounds like airline status to me. What I will say about reviewer times is there are a whole lot of reasons why reviewer times are long. Sometimes they're editorial issues, sometimes they're just like procedural issues that we regret. Every editor has always had a paper that went on too long. I just dealt with one 3 days ago that one of my field editors had been taking too long because reviewers don't respond, things like this. There are all kinds of reasons why they take a long time. It does take a bit of patience and a good bit of patience to go through the review process and wait on these kinds of comments and a judgment on your work. And it's a very stressful kind of time. But I can't imagine that paying a upper class fee would be a great idea.
Okay, thank you very much. Very straightforward answer. Dr. David.
Well, I was just on Twitter the other day where one of the science journals has started doing this, and you can see my views on that. I think it's an absolutely horrific way of doing it. I'm not going to be a part of it. Higher education is quite marketized enough as it is already without this, and particularly as we see that these companies are making an awful lot of money, and even if you are then paying the reviewers, you're paying them a mere pittance. It's ridiculous. I'm not going to be a part of it ever. Just in terms of the review times, we're all doing our full-time jobs. We are living our lives. So yeah, sometimes it takes a long time to get a review, and we all recognize that it's much better if you get your review very, very quickly. But there are only so many hours in a day, and of course it's taking longer in the pandemic situation. I don't know about anybody else, but I have spent this entire academic year feeling completely exhausted. It just took me 3 months to, was it 3? Yeah, 3 months to write my review for a journal. And frankly, when I sent it off, I didn't feel any guilt. I just felt it was amazing that I had managed to get the review off. And it was a good review, not in terms of the result necessarily, but in terms of the amount of thought and effort and everything that went into it. It was very constructive, and that took a lot out of me. So I thought 3 months was fair enough.
Thank you. And finally, Dr. Haastrup.
I don't think there's much to add to what Toni and Maxine have said. I know some academics have sort of said that they will no longer review for Taylor and Francis, and I'm not sure that this is the right approach, because it's sort of penalizing journals that don't even subscribe to it. So this is an approach that is being taken, particularly in the sort of natural and physical sciences. But I mean, it's a definite no for me. If this was something that was brought into the journals that I'm an editorial board member on or currently edits, I would resign immediately. It is unethical, unless, given how much time it takes to actually do this sort of extra job, unless these companies are offering to pay $5,000 per review, there is absolutely no justification for what it is that they're doing. So I think it's very clear that this is not something that, particularly in social sciences and arts and humanities, that has been signed up to. But we should very much be geared to fight it, because I mean, I think that would just be the absolute ruination of what it is that we do. So yeah.
Thank you. Okay, I see we have already one question in the chat. Before addressing it, just one final question from my side. So oftentimes, I mean, here there is, besides lots of native English speakers, we have several non-native PhD students and early career researchers, which oftentimes have important budget constraints. But at the same time, we see how the demand for native speakers to review our manuscripts before submitting is increasing, right? And this also, of course, has a price. So what would be your advice to PhDs and early career researchers who maybe have several things that they have to spend their money on? Is this an absolute priority? Is this something that perhaps does it have to be addressed, for example, in every round of revisions that you submit your piece to in a particular journal? You have to actually make sure that a native speaker reviews the manuscript, or actually could you say, okay, maybe before publishing the piece, just give it to an editor? Or what do you think about this? So I would first give the floor to Dr. David.
Thank you. I think that this is a really difficult question in some ways and a really easy way in others. The first thing is, no, you certainly shouldn't be spending money at the point when you're submitting, right? If reviewers and editors cannot see past some grammatical or syntactical errors to the piece, then I think that you've got a bigger problem, right? First of all, so but in my experience, you could always see beyond those errors to the bigger arguments. So at the kind of submission and revision rounds, I would say no. Beyond the fact that I would say that it is good anyway to have other people read your work, right? So before you submit, and then if people are actually picking up on, okay, there are some errors here, and helping you out with them, then fine, but not for paying a professional to do it. Certainly, I think that ultimately, now when I worked at JSA, we used to do editing, not just as perhaps other journals do it, but I was going through and tracking changes, all right, doing everything. So really improving the English, the structure, absolutely everything. But that, JSA is a very particular journal. It was, our mission was and is to bring doctoral candidates and ECRs along. So we always felt that was part of what we had to do. Other journals aren't going to do that for you. Probably. And obviously, if it's going to be published, you want it to be the best article that it can be. I find it quite annoying, for instance, when I've got an article that I want to quote from in a piece, and then it's just grammatically incorrect. I just feel like, I don't want all these six in the middle of this, so I'm not then going to use it, right? So then actually you reduce your opportunity for citation. And also people are impatient sometimes when reading. So again, if it's just quite difficult to read because of language problems, then you're also, I think, less likely to get cited. I do want to just say something, because I have a lot of sympathy for those who I can't imagine writing in a language other than my own. I speak other languages, but I cannot imagine writing. So I have nothing but respect for people who are not writing in their language. But at the same time, when I'm reading stuff in my language, I want it to read well, right? That's just it. And I do think that kind of one of the problems that we're starting to see is that, I'm increasingly reading a lot of articles with a lot of grammatical errors in them. And I think that this is on journals more than anyone else, but maybe it is something that we need to think about how we address a bit better, because it does seem to me that the quality of writing is deteriorating.
Thank you. Please, Dr. Haastrup.
Right. Okay. So, I mean, I think this question sort of It's a difficult one, I think, for some of what Maxine has already said before, but one of the things, a bit of context, I think is really important. I do think, and this is a personal view, that the hegemony of the English language in publishing is very problematic, but it is what it is. Nevertheless, I think, in this kind of forum, it is important that people keep interrogating this around knowledge production and whose knowledge counts more. This morning, when I was on Twitter, and there was an ad that had been written in Pidgin English, but written by someone who doesn't understand Pidgin English. Now, that's a distinct language on its own. And there's no reason, given how many of the population of the world actually speak this, there's no reason why that couldn't be a language that is used in a journal itself, if we want to disseminate language a bit more. So I'm often quite hesitant about this idea that it's, the problem is non-native speakers, because you find a lot of this with native speakers as well. But perhaps to answer your question directly, I think fundamentally, when I, as an editor, send out something to the reviewer, because I had not just rejected it at this point, I'm wanting to say to the reviewer to take it seriously, that this is a subject that I think is interesting, that meets it potentially meets the standards of our journal, not to say that there can't be more work on it, but that they should take it seriously. And what that means is so if someone writes their, rather than THERE and puts THEIR, it's not the end of the world. That stuff will be caught at the moment of copy editing. But I think, as Maxine says, if your key points you cannot get those across because your sentences are overly long, you're sort of substituting things that shouldn't be there. In the first instance, that stuff probably won't get to the front of the reviewer. And frankly, as Maxine said, they're different journals, but if I'm getting 525 articles a year, I don't have time to go through all of that for you. So for that reason, I think, that's kind of the reason why things get pushed back. Nevertheless, I personally, again, this is me, I don't think people should spend money at that stage on that. But how do you deal with those issues? How do you move away from, the thoughts that are in your head, which, as I said, I think applies to everyone, myself included, to something that is actually readable by someone else? I think that there are ways in which we can sort of devise frameworks for making that happen, using our networks, connecting to writing groups, engaging with your cohort. I say to my students, but also people I mentor, give your work to your engineering friend. They don't have to be experts in that subject area, but can they understand what it is that you're trying to say? And that's a good start to sort of get through that hump. The specialist would understand the concepts a bit better. So I don't think, maybe in the final you want to spend a bit of money, but personally, I really don't think, I really think that is what you should spend your money on. But I think that there are ways of getting around that. Working with professional associations, a lot of professional associations, we have meet the editor sessions where we can sort of give support and feedback. You can create groups within your graduate forum to do that sort of thing periodically, if people are to workshop articles, if people are thinking of submitting, but especially use your universities and certainly engage with your supervisor.
Thank you very much. Professor Bertelli, what would you think about this?
So this, as others have said, this is a difficult issue, and I too can't imagine what it would be like to try to write professionally in a language other than English. However, I will say when articles come in, the desk rejection process is real. We get lots of articles that just aren't ready for us to send out to reviewers. And part of that has to do with writing. It is true that spelling, grammatical errors here and there throughout the paper, that's okay. But the structure of of the piece being something that is unique to the sort of submission itself and not consistent with anything else that's ever been published in this journal or any others, you know, that's bad too. And so you have to look for a sort of sweet spot there. I will also say that I think certainly at Penn State and at other places where I've been, there have been tremendous resources devoted toward both doctoral students and toward early career assistant professors and early tenure track people to, you know, engage in writing groups. Like Penn State has a sort of monthly thing where you walk through and you can engage, as Toni says, your engineering friends. This is really important, and I think this is as important as you know, a proofreader will. I guess I should say it this way: a proofreader will provide you a particular kind of service. That service is similar to what a copy editor would do in a journal. And so you don't really need that at this stage as much as you need a way to provide the information in a comprehensible way, right? So it's the structure and organization of the thing. Now, that being said, there are reviewers who get very grumpy about these kinds of things, and they say this paper is replete with grammatical errors. As an editor, I don't pay any attention to those kind of things. If there are tons of grammatical errors, I will note the same thing, but say focus on these kinds of things first. I and we at JPP tend to write sort of longer letters that really try to position the author in the best possible place to respond to the reviewer comments. So yes, it may happen that you get things back, but remember that it's the sort of structure and organization of the argument and checking for the kinds of grammatical and stylistic considerations that you can do that are really important. But if something doesn't pass a sort of, grammar check by a native speaker, no matter how grumpy they are, that's not a reason in itself not to have something considered. And I hope that most journals, I mean, certainly all the ones I've been involved in and the one that I've been running for 11 years, those, we certainly look past that kind of set of errors. And those errors are made by native speakers, including myself, all the time. So,
thank you very much,
Carlos. Can I just come back, because I did just think about one thing, and it was Anthony talking about structure, languages. Right. So I have worked with people from certain countries where they just write in a very, very different way. So the structure is completely wrong for English, and certainly wrong for English language publishing, right? And I completely agree with Toni about how problematic that is. But I have been sent so like 6,000 word chapters where I understand in the last paragraph what on earth they're writing about, right? Now that is just because of their language, right? That's perfectly consistent with that language, but it's completely inconsistent with the English language, and certainly for English language publishing. So if you're at this stage in your career where you don't really understand this, then really take the opportunity to have these types of conversations. And apart from anything else, that linguistically speaking, they're really interesting conversations to have as well. Simon Usherwood, which anyone knows anything about UACs will know, used to, when we were teaching together, I used to do first year study skills stuff, and I used to ask all members of staff for their one piece of advice for students when writing, and his was always, you're not writing a murder mystery. All right. So in other words, we don't want the denouement, the unveiling right at the end. We want to know up front, what are you talking about? Why does it matter? How are you getting there? What are your conclusions? It's just got to be, just tell us, right? Make sure we understand very early on so that we can then get into the detail of it. And I also just want to say as well, some of the best writing that I get is actually from Danes and Germans, and very often not from native or English people for whom the English language is their first language, because they don't learn grammar anymore. So sometimes that's terribly written.
Thank you so much. Well, now I think it's time to give the floor to the audience. I sincerely apologize because we only have a little bit over 10 minutes. We have to finish, unfortunately, at 11:30 sharp. There are two questions that have been asked in the chat. I will formulate to the two of them at the same time so that the three speakers can react to those that they feel. So the first one was asked by Eliska Ulrichkova. I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing your name in the wrong way, but it says, what do you think about PhD students, early career researchers, how they should choose the journal where to submit? She doesn't mean only the scope, but also the position of particular journal. Is it better to aim to those that are very highly ranked, or it's better to be more pragmatic and not to aim so high? And that would be the first question. The second one was raised by Lucas Fagliano. Thank you very much, Lucas, for actually also thank you, Eliska. He wanted to ask basically if any of the presenters could share their views on the best practices of visualizing and communicating database papers. Do you have any bad experiences in mind about papers that may have had strong data foundations and contributing to the literature, but actually the structure and the data was so badly presented that merited getting the paper rejected? So yes, I don't know. The two questions were not addressed at the particular speaker, so I don't know if you have any reactions. Perhaps let's start with Dr. Haastrup.
Okay. So to the first one, I think I would echo something that Maxine said earlier. What kind of career do you want for yourself? Of course, there are pragmatic reasons to go for top ranking journals, but if you're spending all your energy trying to do that, are you actually able to get the work that you want to be out there? And I say this as someone who does edit a top ranked journal, that I would say at JCMS, we're perhaps a bit different in that we're really, we accept that journal editing and journals to a certain extent serve the function of gatekeeping knowledge as much as we don't want to. But because of that awareness, we are very open to whoever submits, whether you're an early career researcher or you're an established researcher, with all the caveats of what we've already mentioned. But where you submit your work, I think it should really be about who you want to be reading your work, who you want to be engaging with in the context of your work. Because in the end, for me, that's what matters. With respect to particular structures, so I think I think the other Toni is perhaps best able to answer this question, not the least because I think not all journals, just because you're speaking about a particular subject area. So one of the things I find, I can use JCMS as an example, is that although that we're very open to economics, the formatting of economics and the sort of the use of formulas for economics tends to not to speak to a broader audience. And JCMS, first and foremost, is open to a broader audience. So you can submit your economics article, but can someone in sociology and political science who has some knowledge of quantitative methods or modeling actually understand what it is that you're trying to do? Like, people beyond those of us who are on the editorial team have to be able to understand what it is that you're doing. So oftentimes we say that, you know, we're probably not the right fit for that journal. So I think it's about really focusing on what the best fit is for your journal. Not everything that you write will align with what it is that you desire most in terms of where you want to submit, which is why you need to think about where it is you want to submit before you start sort of structuring your paper.
Thank you so much. Professor Bertelli.
These are two great questions. Let me speak to them in order. So, Eliska, this is a hard one to answer, and I'll just be very blunt. You know, if you're at a place like, well, any of the last few places that I've worked, including Penn State now, if you don't publish in one of the top general journals, you won't get tenure and you'll lose your job. So in some sense, because of where you are going to have to focus on these kinds of things. And the question then for you is, how can you make a contribution that really rises to the level of a journal? Or a general journal. So let me make a specific example. Suppose you have a paper that shows the relationship between distributive spending in a very carefully defined community somewhere in the world, and the voting behavior of people in that community. And you've engaged some theories of distributive politics that suggest that this relationship between spending and voting for incumbent candidates should be positive. So this is a very well-worn literature in political science. It has public policy connotations because the distributive spending is providing these goods to local areas. How do you frame that for a general journal? Is it a paper about elections? Is it a paper about representation? Is it a paper about is it a political economy paper about the distributive politics or vote buying or these different kinds of things? This all depends on what you do. And those general journals all have communities in their, communities of specialists in there as well. And I will say that making something like that appeal to a general journal doesn't always satisfy me. I mean, I was complaining to colleagues for 3 weeks about the first line of a paper that I read in the APSR fairly recently that completely turned any conception of democracy that I would understand on its head, but did make the article sound quite general. So yes, you know, there are these questions of bad fit, but you can do that if you have to, and you really won't have a choice in some of those positions. If you do have a choice, and you have a choice sort of across positions, then you can clearly decide what are your general journal kind of contributions and what are your subfield contributions, those more narrower points. To take my example a little bit further, suppose that the distributive spending program had particular characteristics. Those characteristics meant that there were particular stipulations placed on the recipients of the distributive spending, and those are a part of a growing way of spending money in localized communities that's sanctioned, say, by development banks. Something like that happens. Now you're in the realm of a specialist journal, and you can make a contribution talking about that. And so those are the kinds of choices that you have to make. In terms of quantitative presentations, what Toni said, very important. Know your audience, right? So in general, I can say two things. Do not write down mathematically the formula for logistic regression that you do without deriving a new element of an estimation strategy. We know that you can say that it's a logistic regression, and you can talk about these kinds of things in English. If you derive this from a formal model and you send it to a journal like the Journal of Public Policy or anything general, think about what you can place in the appendix and think about what you can place in the text so that a generalist reader can access these kinds of things. And also when it comes to things like figures and graphs, unreadable figures, no matter how extensive your ggplot work was to make them work, unreadable figures are always going to be unreadable figures. Things that are too small, things that could be discussed in the text rather than putting in a superfluous figure. Too many figures, too many charts, too many tables, these kinds of things. You have to think about that as part of the structure and organization of your paper, just the way you would if you had no mathematics or presentation of data whatsoever. So again, no bright line rule there, but don't do things that you really don't have to, do. Thanks.
Thank you so much. And Dr. David, I mean, we don't have a lot of time, but please, we want to hear your view.
Thank you. For Alishka's question, Alishka knows that this isn't going to be a problem for her because she's soon going to have something top on her CV anyway, but it is a really, really important question. So thank you for asking it. We haven't talked about mental health issues, right? Getting lots of rejections can be very, very bad for your mental health, right? So please think about your particular context. You are much more likely to get rejected from a top journal than a mid-ranking or lower ranked journal. So if you're not in the place to get a lot of rejections mentally, why put yourself through it, right? I think it's so important to be thinking about these issues. That's not to say that I don't completely echo what Toni has said, Bertelli, sorry, in terms of if you want to have a career, you've got to be thinking about how committees are going to be reviewing your applications for a job. And for every time that there is somebody like me who says, did you have this on your CV at this point when you applied for your job 15 years ago? There will be somebody else saying, oh, well, no, but they haven't got this top job, right? So you've got to, I've sat on too many of these kind of committees where we're reviewing CVs, where people are actually being quite disparaging about people because they don't have one high impact publication. So that is a consideration. That's not to say that you can't have a balanced CV. You might have one article, have one article that you've sent to a top ranking journal, but then save yourself and send to mid and lower ranking ones for others, right? That balanced CV is important. You've also got to think about publishing times. If everybody is only going for high impact journals, you're going to have a high level of desk rejection naturally. And also it might take longer to get published. So lots of things to consider there. And just to say that in Leiden, I'm in an Institute for History, and they have a completely different attitude towards where and what you should publish than when I worked at the University of Surrey in the UK. So you do also have to think about the country where your career might be and which department that you might be in, right? But I really want to put out a strong message there about protecting your own mental health. I think that the other question's been answered very fulsomely. Can I just very, very quickly say to Patrick, absolutely not. I never ever looked at what university somebody belonged to, just not a consideration at all, really don't care at all. And for Magdalena, I would say if you're reading things like, usually there's a couple of journals that we all return to again and again and again. And if you're reading some articles and thinking, why on earth was that published? They've missed this and everything else. Then I would say that you're ready to review, right? But ask the editors. I used to have a couple of people contact me at JASA saying, I really want to kind of do this, but I'm not sure whether I'm doing it. So can you just tell me a little bit about the process? I was more than happy to answer that and to kind of bring them on board into the process. So don't be afraid to approach editors to ask, is this really the right moment? Would you consider me to be qualified? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, actually. Thank you to the three of you. I mean, just before finishing, to tell the audience that there have been some questions raised in the chat, besides what the answers that Dr. David has given here. Dr. Haastrup and Professor Bertelli have actually replied in the chat. So thank you again also for going here above and beyond your strict duties. This was actually fantastic. This was very enriching, at least for me, and I believe that also our audience was also really interested in your answers and found it. And again, thank you very much for attending, and to our speakers. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for organizing, and nice to meet you all.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Bye.
Enjoy the rest of the day.